At 58, Harlan Beckett fell in love again, and he wasn't ready for what came next. He was a widowed father, a man who buried his wife 6 years earlier and swore on everything sacred in his life that he would never risk his heart again. He had a 15-year-old daughter who still kept her mother's scarf under her pillow. He had a house full of silence. He had a routine designed to keep him numb, and it was working. Then, one Saturday morning at a farmer's market in Savannah, Georgia, a woman behind a table of handmade candles looked at him and said 7 words that cracked him wide open. He didn't plan to fall in love. He didn't plan to let someone in. But the moment he finally did, the moment he finally allowed himself to feel something other than grief, a single phone call at 7:42 on a Tuesday evening threatened to take it all away. This is not just a love story. This is a story about a man who had to decide whether loving again was worth the risk of losing again. And what his 15-year-old daughter did during the darkest hour of his life will stay with you long after this video ends. Stay with me on this one. Every single minute matters. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and slow-simmered tomatoes. Harlan Beckett stood at the stove in his modest 2-story home on the east side of Savannah, stirring a pot of soup with the same wooden spoon Colleen had bought at a flea market 11 years ago. The handle was cracked. He'd glued it twice. He refused to replace it. Behind him, at the dining table, his daughter Margot sat hunched over a geometry textbook, her dark hair falling across her face, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She was 15, sharp-witted, quiet in the way teenagers are when they're carrying something heavier than their age should allow. Every now and then she'd glance up at her father's back and study him the way she studied everything, carefully, looking for things most people missed. It was a Tuesday evening in late February, the kind of night that felt ordinary, the kind of night you forget, unless something happens that burns it into your memory forever. Harlan's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen. An unknown number, a Savannah area code. He almost let it ring out. He hated unknown calls, always had. But something in his chest tightened, a feeling he couldn't name, and he picked up. "Mr. Beckett?" The voice in the other end was calm in that trained, clinical way that medical professionals learn, the steadiness that's meant to keep you from falling apart before they finish the sentence. "This is Memorial Health. We have you listed as the emergency contact for Renata Solis." Harlan's hand stopped stirring. "There's been an accident, Mr. Beckett. Miss Solis was brought in approximately 30 minutes ago. She's in critical condition. We need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible." The wooden spoon slipped from his fingers and clattered against the rim of the pot. A splash of hot broth hit the stovetop and hissed. Margot looked up. She saw her father's face, the way the color drained from it, the way his jaw locked, the way his eyes went somewhere far away and terrible. She had seen that exact expression once before, 6 years ago, on a night she had spent every day since trying to forget. "Dad?" Harlan didn't answer. He set the phone down slowly, as if it weighed 100 pounds, and gripped the edge of the counter with both hands. His knuckles went white. "Dad, talk to me." "Get your coat," he said. His voice was low, controlled, breaking at the edges. "We need to go to the hospital." Margot didn't ask who, she didn't ask why. She just stood up, grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door, and followed her father out into the cold. The drive to Memorial Health took 14 minutes. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engine, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers against a light drizzle, and the quiet, desperate breathing of a man trying to hold himself together for his daughter. Margot sat in the passenger seat with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, staring straight ahead. She could feel it, the weight of the silence, the gravity of whatever was waiting for them at the end of this drive. She'd lived through this before, the late-night rush, the fluorescent corridors, the smell of antiseptic that she could never fully wash out of her memory. When they arrived, Harlan parked crookedly and didn't bother correcting it. They walked through the emergency entrance side by side. A surgeon in blue scrubs met them in the corridor, a tall woman with kind but exhausted eyes, who introduced herself and led them to a small consultation room. She explained it carefully. Renata had been driving home on a two-lane road on the outskirts of the city. A 22-year-old college student heading in the opposite direction, a young man who had been awake for nearly 20 hours after pulling a double shift at his part-time job, had fallen asleep at the wheel. His car drifted across the center line and struck Renata's vehicle head-on. 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, severe internal bleeding. She was in surgery now. The surgeon said other things after that, words like stabilize and the next 48 hours and cautiously optimistic, but Harlan heard none of it. He was underwater. Everything was muffled and slow and impossibly heavy. He found a plastic chair in the waiting room and sat down. He pressed both hands to his face and stayed there, perfectly still, like a man who had been turned to stone. Margot sat beside him. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, gently, she leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered something so quiet it was almost just breath. "She's strong, Dad. She's the strongest person I've ever met, besides Mom." Harlan's shoulders shook once, just once. Then he went still again. But to understand why those 6 words nearly broke him, to understand the full weight of what was happening in that waiting room, you need to know the man Harlan Beckett was before Renata Solis walked into his life. You need to go back to the silence, back to the empty chair, back to the years he spent convincing himself that his heart had nothing left to give.
6 years earlier, Colleen Beckett died in the oncology ward of a Savannah hospital on a Wednesday morning in April. She was 49 years old. She had been fighting ovarian cancer for 14 months, and she fought it the way she did everything, fiercely, quietly, with a stubborn grace that made everyone around her believe she was going to win. She didn't win. Harlan was holding her hand when she passed. Margot was at school. He had told her that morning that Mom was resting, that everything was going to be fine. It was the first real lie he had ever told his daughter, and the guilt of it lived in his chest like a stone for years afterward. The funeral was on a Saturday. It rained. Margot wore a black dress Colleen had bought her for a piano recital the year before. She didn't cry during the service. She didn't cry at the burial. She waited until midnight that night when she thought her father was asleep and crept into Colleen's closet, sat down on the floor among the hanging dresses and folded sweaters, pulled one of her mother's scarves to her face and breathed it in. That's where Harlan found her. He'd heard her footsteps in the hallway. He stood in the doorway of the closet and watched his 9-year-old daughter cradle a piece of fabric like it was the last living thing her mother had ever touched. And in that moment, something inside Harlan Beckett closed shut. A door, a valve, a fuse, whatever you want to call it. Something that protected the remaining contents of his heart by sealing them off from the world entirely. He didn't fall apart loudly. That wasn't his way. He fell apart in the small, invisible moments, reaching for 2 coffee mugs in the morning, then pausing, then putting one back on the shelf. Setting the dinner table for 3 out of habit, then staring at the empty chair across from him until the food went cold. Finding one of Colleen's earrings behind the bathroom sink, a small gold hoop, and holding it in his palm for 20 minutes without moving. He poured everything into Margot. Woke at 5 every morning to make her breakfast, packed her lunch with a note, always the same 3 words, "Love you, kid." Drove her to school, went to work as a civil engineer for the city of Savannah, came home, cooked dinner, helped with homework, and then sat on the back porch alone, listening to the crickets until the exhaustion outweighed the grief and he could sleep without dreaming. Friends tried. They gently suggested he get out there, maybe try one of those dating apps, maybe let somebody set him up. Harlan always declined with the same tight smile and the same quiet deflection.
"I'm fine," he'd say. "Margot keeps me busy." And people would nod and let it go, because there's only so many times you can push a man who's made peace with being alone. But Margot saw through it. She was young, but she wasn't naive. She watched her father move through the house like a ghost in his own life, present but hollow, functional but fading. He smiled, sure. He laughed at her jokes, attended her school events, helped her build a pinhole camera for a science fair. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that her mother used to say could calm a hurricane, they were dimmer now, like someone had turned the wattage down and forgotten to turn it back up. By the time Margot turned 15, she had started a quiet ritual of her own. Every morning before school, she'd write a small note and leave it on the dashboard of her father's truck. Things like, "Have a good day, Dad, you're doing great," or "I made your coffee extra strong, you're welcome." Or sometimes, on the hard days, simply, "I love you, Mom does too." Harlan never mentioned the notes, but he saved every single one in the glove compartment, stacked neatly in a rubber band. By the time there were over 200 of them, the glove compartment barely closed. That was Harlan Beckett, a man held together by routine, responsibility, and the love of a daughter who refused to let him vanish into his own sadness. A man who had convinced himself, genuinely, completely, that the romantic part of his life was over. Then came September. Margot was working on a photography project for her sophomore year art class, candid portraits of everyday people in public spaces. She needed real settings, real faces, real moments. She begged Harlan to take her to the Forsyth Park Farmers Market on Saturday morning. Harlan hated crowds. He hated small talk. He hated the idea of standing around pretending to care about artisanal cheese while strangers bumped into him. But Margot asked with those eyes, Colleen's eyes, and he was powerless. "Fine," he said, "but we're leaving by noon." They didn't leave by noon. The Forsyth Park Farmers Market on a late September morning in Savannah is something close to magic if you let it be. The air that Saturday was thick with the smell of kettle corn and fresh basil, and something floral that Harlan couldn't quite place. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like curtains, swaying lazily in the warm breeze. Vendors lined the walkways with folding tables covered in local honey, hand-thrown pottery, homemade soaps, and things Harlan had no use for but Margot found endlessly fascinating. She vanished within 5 minutes. Camera in hand, she disappeared into the crowd like a fish released into open water, darting between booths, crouching low for angles, snapping candid shots of an old man selling peaches and a little girl reaching for a balloon. Harlan watched her go, shook his head, and found himself standing alone near a table of homemade preserves, feeling thoroughly out of place. That's when he heard it. "You look like a man who's been dragged here against his will." The voice was warm, slightly amused, and came from somewhere to his left. He turned. She was standing behind a small booth lined with hand-poured candles in mason jars and bundles of dried lavender tied with twine. A small chalkboard sign propped in front read, in neat handwriting, "Wren and Sparrow Candle Co., handmade in Savannah." Her name was Renata Solis. She was 45. She had dark auburn hair pulled loosely to one side, warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and a way of holding herself that suggested she had been through something difficult and come out the other side with a quiet, hard-won dignity. Harlan let out a short laugh. The sound surprised him. It came out rusty, like a door hinge that hadn't been used in years. "That obvious?" he said. "Only to someone who's been there," she replied. She gestured to the empty chair behind her booth. "I spent my first 3 markets looking exactly like you, like I was waiting for someone to give me permission to leave." They talked. Harlan didn't know for how long. Later, he would realize it had been almost 40 minutes, which was 39 minutes longer than he typically talked to strangers. She told him she'd moved to Savannah from a small town near Wilmington, North Carolina, about 7 years ago after a divorce that had left her hollowed out and questioning everything she thought she knew about herself. No children. She'd started making candles in her kitchen as a way to keep her hands busy while her mind healed. "Therapy with a match," she said, and smiled in a way that made Harlan's chest feel tight. He didn't tell her much about himself that morning. He wasn't ready, but he bought a candle, cedar and vanilla, and when she handed it to him, their fingers brushed, and something passed between them. Not electricity, not fireworks, something quieter and more terrifying, a warmth, a recognition, like his heart had lifted its head after 6 years of sleeping and whispered, "Oh, there you are." He went home that afternoon and set the candle on the kitchen windowsill. He didn't light it for 3 days. When he finally did, the scent filled the house and made it feel, for just a moment, less empty. He went back the next Saturday, told himself it was because Margot wanted more photos. Margot didn't even bring her camera. The third Saturday, Renata had a cup of coffee waiting for him. "Black, no sugar," she said. "You seem like a black, no sugar kind of man." She was right. By the fifth Saturday, the market had become something else entirely. After Renata packed up her booth, they'd walk through the park together, slowly, no rush. The late afternoon sun turning the oak canopy into gold. She talked about her childhood. Her father had been a shrimper, and she'd spent her earliest years on the deck of his boat, learning to read the tides before she could read books. She told him the ocean taught her patience. "You can't rush the water," she said. "You just have to show up and wait for it to bring you what it's going to bring you." And Harlan, this quiet, guarded man who hadn't opened up to another person in 6 years, told her about Colleen. He told her about the diagnosis, the treatments, the last morning. He told her about the empty chair at the dinner table. He told her about finding Margot in the closet with the scarf. His voice cracked twice. He didn't apologize for it. Renata didn't ask him to. She just listened. Not the polite, surface-level listening that most people offer, the kind where they're already composing their response before you finish speaking. Real listening. The kind where someone turns their full attention toward you like a lantern and simply lets you be seen. And in that listening, something inside Harlan began to unclench. A fist he didn't know he'd been holding for 6 years, slowly, carefully opened. Their first real date was in early November. He took her to a small Italian restaurant on East Bay Street, white tablecloths, candlelight, a guitar player in the corner who was slightly out of tune but meant well. They shared a plate of pasta and a bottle of red wine. Renata told him a story about the time she accidentally set her kitchen curtains on fire, testing a new candle fragrance, a eucalyptus and sage blend that turned out to be, in her words, aggressively flammable. Harlan laughed so hard he nearly knocked over his wineglass. It was a full laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, the kind his body had almost forgotten how to produce. At the end of the night, he drove her home. She lived in a small bungalow with a front porch wrapped in jasmine vine. She stood on the top step and turned to face him. The porch light caught her eyes, and for a moment, Harlan forgot every reason he'd built those walls. "I wasn't looking for this, Harlan," she said softly. "Neither was I," he said. She leaned forward and kissed him on the cheek. It was brief and gentle, barely a whisper of contact, but it sent a tremor through him that reached all the way down to the foundation. She went inside. He sat in his truck in her driveway for 5 full minutes, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, his heart pounding like it had just remembered what it was built for. If you believe in second chances, the kind that show up when you've completely stopped looking, drop a heart in the comments right now. And if this story is already pulling at something inside you, hit that subscribe button for Soul Tale and tell us where in the world are you watching from. Telling Margot was the part Harlan dreaded most. He waited until a quiet evening in December. The house smelled like pine. Margot had insisted on a real Christmas tree, the way her mother always had. They were sitting in the living room, the tree lights casting soft patterns across the walls, when Harlan set down his coffee and said, "I need to talk to you about something." Margot looked at him. She could read her father the way sailors read weather. She'd already knew something had shifted in him over the past few weeks. He hummed in the mornings now. He'd started shaving on weekends, which he never used to do. He smiled at his phone sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. Harlan chose his words carefully, the way a man steps across a frozen river, slowly, testing each surface before committing his weight. He told her about Renata, about the market, about the walks and the dinners, and the way this woman made him feel like maybe his story wasn't over yet. Margot listened without interrupting. Her face was still, unreadable. When he finished, the silence stretched between them like a held breath. Then she asked one question, just one. "Does she make you happy?" Harlan's voice was barely a whisper. "She does." Margot nodded, slowly, thoughtfully, the way someone nods when they're making a decision that costs them something, but they know it's right. "Then I want to meet her." The dinner happened the following weekend. Renata arrived at the Beckett house carrying a bottle of sparkling cider and a small potted succulent. "Because flowers die," she explained, "and I wanted to bring something that sticks around." It was such a perfectly Renata thing to say that Harlan felt his chest swell.
The first 20 minutes were painful, the kind of silence that fills a room when everyone is performing normalcy instead of living it. Margot was polite but guarded. Renata was warm but nervous. Harlan sat between them, feeling like a man trying to hold two magnets together that weren't quite sure they wanted to connect. Then Renata asked about the photography. "Your dad tells me you have a real eye," she said. "I'd love to see your work sometime." Something flickered in Margot's expression, a crack in the armor. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her portfolio. Renata leaned in, genuinely interested, asking questions about composition and lighting and what drew Margot to certain subjects. And then Margot stopped scrolling. She turned the phone toward Renata and said, "This is the one I'm most proud of." It was a photo from the farmer's market, that very first Saturday in September. A candid shot of Harlan standing at Renata's booth, his head tilted slightly, a half smile on his face. He didn't know he'd been photographed. He didn't know Margot had seen. "I hadn't seen my dad smile like that in years," Margot said quietly. Renata looked at the photo for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were glistening. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. From that evening forward, something began to grow between the three of them, carefully, organically, like a vine finding its way toward sunlight. Renata taught Margot how to make peach cobbler using her grandmother's recipe, a recipe she said had been passed down through 4 generations of soulless women and had never once been written down. They spent a Sunday afternoon repainting the guest room together, arguing cheerfully about whether the accent wall should be sage green or dusty blue. Renata won. It was sage green. But there was one thing Renata did, or rather didn't do, that mattered more than all the rest. She never tried to replace Colleen. She never sat in Colleen's chair at the dinner table. She never suggested moving Colleen's photos. When Margot mentioned her mother, which she did, often and without warning, Renata didn't flinch or redirect. She leaned in. She asked questions. She honored the woman who had come before her without jealousy or insecurity, because she understood something that many people never learn. You don't compete with someone's past. You make room for it. And that, more than the cobbler, more than the sage green wall, more than any single grand gesture, is what made Margot trust her. By January, the Beckett house had changed. There was laughter now, real laughter, the kind that echoes off walls that had known only silence. There were movie nights and Sunday morning pancakes and the smell of Renata's candles drifting through the hallways like a quiet promise. Margot photographed everything. She was building a visual diary of her father's second chapter, and for the first time in years, the pictures showed a man who looked fully alive. But what none of them knew, what no one could have known, is that February had one more Tuesday left, and that Tuesday was going to change everything.
Now you know. Now you know who Harlan Beckett was when that phone rang at 7:42 on a February evening. Now you know the weight of what he carried into that hospital waiting room. Now you know why Margot's whispered words, "She's the strongest person I've ever met besides Mom," landed on him like a collapsing wall. Because this wasn't just a man worried about a woman he cared about. This was a man who had already survived the unsurvivable once. This was a man who had spent 6 years rebuilding a life from rubble, brick by agonizing brick, only to finally, reluctantly, beautifully, let someone back inside. And now, under the same fluorescent lights, surrounded by the same antiseptic smell, sitting in the same kind of plastic chair he'd sat in when Colleen was dying, he was being asked to face the possibility that the universe had given him hope just to rip it away. The hours in that waiting room moved like cold honey. Harlan stared at a crack in the wall. Margot brought him water from a vending machine. He held the cup but didn't drink. She sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, her camera bag at her feet. She didn't take it out. Some moments aren't meant to be captured. They're meant to be endured. At one point, it might have been an hour in, it might have been 3, Harlan leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and whispered something so quiet that Margot almost missed it. "Not again. I can't do this again." Margot took his hand. She didn't say it would be okay. She'd learned young that those words are sometimes a lie people tell because the truth is too heavy. She just held on. The surgeon emerged just after 11. Renata had survived the surgery. The internal bleeding had been controlled. Her lung was reinflated. But the next 48 hours were critical. She wasn't out of danger yet. They let Harlan see her. She was lying in the ICU, connected to monitors and IV lines, her face bruised and swollen, her breathing shallow and mechanical. She looked small, smaller than he had ever seen her, and the sight of it broke something inside him that he didn't know was still intact. He pulled a chair to her bedside and took her hand. It was limp, cold. He wrapped both of his around it and leaned close. "You don't get to leave. You hear me, Renata? I already said goodbye to one woman I loved in a room like this. I am not doing it again. So you fight. You fight and you come back to me." Behind him, in the doorway, Margot stood watching. She raised her camera by instinct, then slowly lowered it. She pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes, tears sliding silently down her cheeks.
Renata woke up on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days after the accident. The first thing she saw was Harlan, sitting in the same chair, wearing the same clothes, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Beside him on the windowsill was a small bundle of dried lavender. He'd driven to her shop, let himself in with the spare key she kept under a terracotta pot, and brought it back so the room would smell like her instead of the hospital. She blinked. Her lips moved. Her voice was barely there, a dry, cracked whisper. "You look terrible," she said. Harlan laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and a sob, an ugly, messy, beautiful sound, and he pressed his forehead to her hand and stayed there until the shaking stopped. The recovery was long and brutal, weeks in the hospital. The broken ribs made every breath feel like a punishment. Physical therapy began in March, slow, frustrating sessions that left Renata exhausted and, on the worst days, weeping from pain and anger at her own body's limitations. But Harlan was there, every single morning. Before visiting hours officially began, the nurses would find him sitting in the hallway outside her room with 2 cups of coffee and a lavender bundle. They stopped asking him to wait. They just started unlocking the door early. Margot came every afternoon after school. She brought her camera and began documenting what she called The Comeback, a photo series that tracked Renata's recovery in quiet, honest images. Renata's hand gripping the rail of a walker, the first time she stood on her own, a close-up of her face laughing at something Harlan said, the bruises fading to yellow and green. The afternoon in April when she finally sat on Harlan's back porch again, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun drop below the tree line. Margot captured each moment with the care of someone who understood that healing isn't a single event. It's a series of small, stubborn victories strung together like beads on a thread. By June, Renata was walking without assistance. By July, she was back at her candle workshop for a few hours a day. By August, she was testing new fragrances again, though she kept a fire extinguisher within arm's reach at all times, just in case the eucalyptus gets any ideas. And then came a September evening, almost exactly 1 year since the morning they met, when everything came full circle. They were sitting on Harlan's back porch. The air smelled like cut grass and jasmine. Fireflies blinked lazily across the yard. Somewhere down the street, someone was playing an old soul record, and the faint melody drifted over the rooftops like a memory. Renata turned to him. Her eyes were clear. Her voice was steady. "I thought love was something I had already used up," she said, "like it was a finite thing, like everyone only gets a certain amount, and once it's gone, it's gone. But you showed me something, Harlan. You showed me that love regenerates. It grows back, and it grows back stronger in the broken places." Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a small velvet box. Renata's hands flew to her mouth. "I've already lost one woman I loved," he said. His voice cracked. He didn't try to stop it. "And when I almost lost you, when I sat in that hospital and felt the whole world tilting sideways, I made myself a promise. I promised that if you came back to me, I would never waste another day being afraid of happiness." He opened the box. Inside, set in a simple gold band, was a single pale green stone, a peridot, Renata's birthstone. Not flashy, not extravagant, just right. "Marry me," he said. "Not because life is short, but because whatever time we have left, I want to spend it with you." Renata was crying. Not the delicate kind of crying you see in the movies, the real kind, the kind where your whole face crumbles and your breath comes in stutters and the tears fall so fast you can't wipe them away. Through it all, through the trembling and the disbelief and the overwhelming wave of everything she'd spent years believing she would never have, she whispered one word: "Yes." And behind the screen door, standing in the warm glow of the kitchen light with her camera raised to her eye, Margot Beckett captured the moment. The porch light illuminating Renata's tear-streaked face. Harlan on one knee, the velvet box open in his hands. The Georgia sky behind them, fading from amber to deep, endless violet. She would later title the photograph, "Second Chance." It became the most treasured image she would ever take. They were married the following October, on a Saturday afternoon in Forsyth Park, the same park where they had met exactly 1 year earlier, under the same live oaks draped in Spanish moss, surrounded by the same soft Savannah light that had witnessed their very first conversation. The ceremony was small, 23 guests, white folding chairs arranged in a half circle, no grand venue, no elaborate decorations, just the trees, the light, and the people who mattered. Renata walked down the aisle carrying a bouquet of dried lavender and wildflowers she had arranged herself. Harlan stood waiting in a charcoal suit, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes already red before she reached him. Margot stood beside her father as maid of honor. She wore a simple blue dress and held a single sunflower, her mother's favorite. During the ceremony, Margot was asked to read something she'd written. She stepped forward, unfolded a piece of notebook paper, and spoke in a voice that was steady but fragile, the voice of a girl who had grown up too fast and understood things about love and loss that most people don't learn until they're twice her age. "My mom taught my dad how to love," she read. "She taught him to be gentle and patient and brave. And when she left, he tried to keep being all those things, for me. But I could see him fading, a little more every year, like a photograph left in the sun." She paused, swallowed. "Renata didn't try to replace my mom. She never could, and she never wanted to. What she did was something different. She taught my dad that it was okay to love again, that opening your heart to someone new doesn't mean closing it to someone you lost. It just means your heart is bigger than you thought. She looked at Harlan, then at Renata, then back down at her paper. I don't think my mom would have wanted my dad to sit on that porch alone forever. I think, wherever she is, she sent someone to make sure he didn't have to. She folded the paper. The guests were silent. Harlan was weeping openly. Renata reached across and took Margot's hand, and the three of them stood there beneath the oaks, connected, imperfect, whole. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and the last of the afternoon light filtered through the moss, someone asked Harlan what surprised him most about falling in love at 58. He thought for a moment, then he smiled, that real smile, the one Margot had captured in a photograph a year ago at a farmer's market booth, and said, I thought my heart had retired. Turns out it was just waiting for the right reason to start beating again. The last photograph Margot took that day was of the three of them walking through the park as the sun went down. Margot in the middle, Harlan on one side, Renata on the other, each of them holding one of Margot's hands. Spanish moss above, golden light around. A family, not rebuilt from what was lost, but grown from what remained. Different from what came before, but no less real, no less sacred, no less beautiful. Harlan Beckett spent 6 years believing his story was over, that love was a one-time thing, something that happened once, burned bright, and left ashes you spent the rest of your life sifting through. He was 58 years old. He had a daughter who left him notes on his dashboard, and a house full of silence, and a back porch where he sat every night listening to crickets because it was easier than listening to his own thoughts. And then a woman behind a table of lavender candles looked at him on a September morning and said, "You look like a man who's been dragged here against his will." And everything changed. Not all at once, not in some dramatic, cinematic explosion of feeling, but slowly, Saturday by Saturday, coffee by coffee, walk by walk, the way real love actually works, not like a lightning strike, but like the tide. You don't see it coming. You don't hear it arrive. You just look down one day and realize the water is all around you, and you're not drowning. You're floating. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that it's never too late to let someone in, that your heart is braver than you think, and that the best chapters of your life might still be unwritten, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me, do you believe in second chances? I read every single one. And if you're not yet part of the Soul Tales family, subscribe and hit that bell, because every week we tell stories that remind you what it means to be human. I'll see you in the next one.